Hello there, wherever you are in the world. So much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing fabulous, thank you very much. And I hope you're managing to settle in with a change of season, because wherever you are, it's either getting hotter or colder. So I hope you're going to brace yourself for the warmth or brace yourself to cool down. And do that by getting yourself a fabulous drink, something refreshing and cooling, or something warming and comforting. But before we get started with tonight's story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. But before we get started, I'd love to remind you that I do love hearing from you. I love hearing about what you're drinking, whereabouts in the world you're from. So don't forget to leave me some comments. So let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, the year was 1945. I was 8 years old at the time. I was being raised by two self-sacrificing wonderful women, my mother and my grandmother, in the Lexington area of the bluegrass state of Kentucky. Suffice to say, regretfully, there were no male role models in my young life, as my mother was estranged from my father, while my grandfather was by then long since deceased, as he had died in his late 30s a long time ago. My mother was a librarian who worked in the local town. She was an ardent book lover who revelled in her job. She enjoyed organising book clubs and audio readings for children and adults alike. For those were the days when social media had not arrived on the scene, so for entertainment purposes, people always gravitated to the storytelling or reading at the local library. So it really was a no-brainer that my grandmother would take me under her charge while my mother was at work. The arrangement suited her well. The three of us lived together very cosily in an idyllic Georgian-style country cottage on a large horse farm that in previous years had been owned by my grandparents, but my grandmother had sold the farm before I was even born. Subsequently, she had been allowed to keep the charming, whimsical cottage on the grounds for herself, as agreed upon by the new owners. My grandmother loved to surround herself with horses. She adored their gentle, intelligent natures, so living apart from them was a nonsensical idea. She boarded her bay and black horse Cleopatra on the farm so that she could ride her in the open countryside whenever she wished. The sight of the graceful, majestic, lofty silhouettes of the horses frolicking and cantering across the fields brought her a great measure of comfort. Furthermore, the smell of hay, leather and tack were exceedingly agreeable to her. They reminded her of warm summer days trotting in the open sunshine, the wind blowing against her cheeks, with her legs pressed against the saddle, while she bobbed up and down on the horse's glistening back, through pretty sparkling meadows bespeckled with bright colourful flowers, while listening to the tweets, trills and warbles of the birds in the valley. The old-world, poetic but stylish-looking cottage looked like something you'd expect to see in the Scottish Highlands. It was affectionately called Whispering Hills Cottage, situated at the far right-hand side of the horse farm, well away from the main house, where a single fork in the asphalt road, marked with a sign labelled Whistling Hills Cottage, along with a pointed arrow, led directly to my grandmother's enchanting abode, that blended so seamlessly into the environment. It was as pretty as a picture, a white brick building with a wholesome simplicity about it that was remarkably endearing. It possessed sash windows, a wraparound porch, a grey slate roof that overlooked the most idyllic, awe-inspiring views over a silvery lake, that was heavily flanked by a pristine, statuesque woodgrove that opened up into bounteous horse-riding trails sprawling over a vast distance. My grandmother loved nothing better than to sit back on the wraparound porch in her rocking chair with her knitting, while she watched a plethora of bird life, along with ducks and their ducklings, not to mention the indigenous animals that visited the lake regularly for a drink. She had seen a family of raccoons, a handful of deers, and even a couple of mountain lions frequent the lake consistently. There were times when my grandmother was so busy that she'd call Bertha, the lady of the forest, to take care of me. I'm not sure that even my mother knew about this cosy, convivial arrangement. It was probably a good thing she didn't. My grandmother would whistle, and then out of the woods this tall, hairy female creature would emerge. It's amazing how when you're 8 years old, you accept the unusual and the outlandish as if it's the most natural, normal thing in the entire world. The guileless, unassuming Bertha did not look like my mother's regular friends. For a start, she never wore clothes. Her whole body was covered in long, flowing dark hair. But for the first time I met her, and from that moment, I liked her. for there was something so wholesome, salutary, organic, and reassuring about her, possibly because she was so unsophisticated, unpretentious, and ingenious. I remember she was taller than our front door, easily as wide, with overlong arms and a pyramid-shaped head that flowed seamlessly into her shoulders. She was robust, but it was her fresh, hairless face that was remarkably human, while her bear-like brown eyes always twinkled with merriment. I didn't really consider Bertha not to be human. In my eyes she was a very big, unpolished, unvarnished, and native forest lady that was covered in hair. That was the only thing that set her apart from other human beings. My grandmother would say to me, "You go and play with Bertha. Grammy's got lots of things she needs to do." Bertha knew instinctively that my grandmother wanted her to babysit me. She was absolutely delighted to oblige. She gave my Gram an agreeable nod, while my Gram in return gave her an affectionate nudge. Bertha would lower her Titanic-sized powerful body that rippled with muscle into a low squatting position so that I could easily climb onto her substantial-sized shoulders. Then she would hold my legs down with her overlong arms and would glide with me perched on her shoulders into the heart of the woods. I would be giggling, "Look at me, Grammy! Look at me! I'm on top of the world! I'm on top of the world! Look at me, Grammy!" I would wave at my Grammy while she'd watch us riding into the woods with a big smile on her face. "Have a nice time, sweetheart," she'd call out while she waved. Even at that young age, I realised that riding Bertha was unorthodox and different, poles apart from riding a horse, as I'd ridden a horse on the farm many times before. Bertha almost floated with me seated on her shoulders. I never experienced those jiggling up and down jolts that you invariably experience on the back of a horse. Bertha would take me into a part of the woods well away from any hiking trails to a secret area where many branches had been strategically placed in strange crosses and diagonals, as if Bertha had been marking her own territory with a series of keep-out signs, like a boundary wall or a hedgerow around a person's home. Beyond this quintessential marker was an area heavily flanked by red maple trees. In its central core was a neatly swept clearing the size of a small room that was so inconspicuous it was almost invisible. We would play together in this rustic nursery all kinds of games using sticks and stones. One of the games was really weird, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. Bertha would look at a stone. I would guess exactly what it was. I would see a rabbit in my head. Bertha would nod. Yes, it was a rabbit. Next time I would see a fox. She would nod. Yes, it was a fox. I was right about that too. Now I believe this game was a telepathic transfer, where she portrayed or projected a visionary impression on a stone, and I had to perceive it. I'm not sure I'd be good at such a game today, but in those days as a kid, the game flowed seamlessly for me. Another game we played an awful lot was piling sticks over a little stone. The object was to remove the stone under the sticks without moving the sticks above the stone at all. I found it exceedingly difficult to achieve this without unsettling all the overlying sticks, but for Bertha it was so easy. We also played games with garden snails by laying leaves on the ground like a large canvas sheet, where we would place bets on which snail would win the race, after which Bertha usually ate the snails. She would pull out their heads with her tongue and swallow them whole. I would kill myself laughing. "You ate a snail! Yucky, yucky! You ate a snail!" Bertha would sometimes speak audible words to me while she braided my hair, so whatever language she actually spoke, it had a very distinguishable dialect. I never queried what she was saying, but thoroughly enjoyed being in her company, especially when she took me riding on her shoulders, or we went berry picking together, or throwing stones in the lake. Of course, any games that required a measure of artful dexterity, I would lose hopelessly. No prizes for guessing who won those games. My memory of Bertha was of an uncorrupted, generous creature, with a heart of solid gold that was as graceful as she was comical, courageous and strong, with a very nurturing, protective instinct, unlike anything I've ever seen before. I always knew without a shadow of a doubt I was so safe in her charge. It was years later, after my grandmother had sold Whistling Hills Cottage and moved into a nursing home, having become increasingly fragile, that I was to learn more about Bertha. You see, growing up, I had not asked my Grammy any questions about her. I mean, why on earth would I do such a thing, as Bertha was such a natural part of my life growing up, that I never questioned or queried it. Bertha was my grandmother's unpretentious forest friend, who was covered in hair. I thought nothing of it, until I began to learn about the Patterson Gremlin footage. That was when I realised my childhood friend or babysitter had been a Sasquatch, Bigfoot, abominable snowman, or Yeti if you like. It made me feel very special that I had had such intimate contact with such a remarkable creature. But where did she come from? How did my grandmother know her? Why had my grandmother trusted her to take charge over me? I knew the next time I went to visit her at the nursing home, I was going to probe ever deeper in regards to the serious mysteries that surrounded Bertha, who had minded me when I was a little girl all those years ago. Did my grandmother even know Bertha was a Sasquatch? I seriously doubted it. I arrived at the nursing home on a Friday afternoon, more than a little eager to see my grandmother. Most of the nurses knew me so well by now, so they nodded at me cordially with a swift, polite, courteous bob of their heads, as I eagerly sauntered past them. In my hands I was carrying a huge, fragrant bouquet of pink, yellow and purple roses. My grandmother was sitting in an upholstered chair, knitting away speedily at a sweater that she was making for me, when I entered the room unannounced. She looked up at me in surprise, for she hadn't been expecting a visit from me. It was a far cry from Whistling Hills Cottage, a small confined carpeted Spartan space with a single bed, along with a bedside table that boasted an eclectic vintage-looking lamp on its surface. There was a small dresser, a coffee table, a long, thin, rather wobbly wooden closet that looked as if it had seen better days, and was probably as unsteady and unstable on its feet as many of the care home residents were. There was a confined cubicle area that contained a bog-standard white porcelain sink, a loo, a bath, and it was hideously ugly, with wrought iron safety bars attached to them, rubber non-slip mats, obviously for the weak and frail, that would have made your average interior designer want to scream out in horror at the hideous blot on the landscape. But then, as is the case in any care home, practicality overrides beauty at every turn. Even though it was all so desperately basic, exceedingly mundane, tediously beige, at the very least the room opened out onto a small patio that overlooked some pretty green lawns, along with a scattering of mature oak trees, while there was a plethora of bright purple wooden garden benches on display to accommodate the residents along with their guests. I was so struck by how frail and shrunken my grandmother had become, rather like an old shriveled lemon that had lost the cushioning of the pith and become hard. Even though she looked so fragile and gaunt, her pale Arctic blue eyes glittered, twinkled and sparkled with a youthful mischief. I was so glad that despite her physical decline, her mind remained unflinchingly sharp, much like a pencil. "It's so good to see you, dear," she said to me, as she watched me arrange the colourful roses I'd brought for her in a glass vase, placing them on the coffee table. "Oh, there you are. That's so much better. Isn't that pretty?" I said. "Thank you, dear. That's lovely. I do love roses, and those smell absolutely wonderful." "I've got something for you," I said, handing her a tuft of hair in a banker's plastic bag. "That's from Cleopatra's grandchild's mane," I said, referring to one of my grandmother's favourite horses. "I know I couldn't bring her to you, but I thought a tuft of her hair, along with a picture, would do the trick." "Thank you, dear," said my grandmother. "You always were so thoughtful, Flora." She studied the framed photograph I'd presented her, which had been recently taken on the horse farm where I'd grown up as a young girl at Whispering Hills Cottage. I was now stabling a horse of mine on the farm, so I regularly visited the place. My grandmother studied the photograph of the horse, with a bright smile bursting on her face like the sunshine on a cloudy day. A lone nostalgic tear began to trickle down her papery cheek. "No, don't get me started, dear," she said, dabbing away her tears with a tissue. "Looking at the pictures brings back so many glorious memories of my youthful days spent on the farm. I miss them so much, the horses, the fields, the smell of leather and hay. You must grab your youth, dear, very fast. Believe me, it's so fleeting." "Grammy," I said, "do you remember Bertha?" My grandmother's face lit up like a Christmas tree. "Bertha! Oh, I remember Bertha. What a beautiful, beautiful soul she was. Do you know she used to look after you for me when you were little? I wonder how she is, whether she's still in life or not." "I remember her well, Gram," I said. "But where did you meet her? I mean, she wasn't like other people, was she? She was covered with hair for a start, and she was exceedingly big." "Do you really want to know how I met Bertha?" my grandmother asked me. It's an extraordinary story, it really is. But if I don't tell it to you now, it'll go down to the grave with me, and that would be an awful pity. I nodded. I'd love to know. Please tell me. My grandmother was still for a moment, almost as if in reflective thought. I suppose you have a right to know the truth. Well, Bertha killed your grandfather. That's how I met her, after she kicked him to death with her powerful legs. What? But why? I don't understand. Why would you let Bertha look after me if she killed my own Gramps? Why would you do it? None of it makes any sense at all. I began awkwardly pacing the room, wringing my fists together in agitation. I mean, Bertha, I don't understand. Why would she do such a terrible, terrible thing? The way I remember her, she was such a loving, gentle creature. Why on earth would she kill my Gramps? Bertha, said my Grammy, looking at me with stern blue eyes. I trusted her with my life. It was your grandfather that was the monster, not Bertha. Monster? What do you mean he was a monster? You never made mention of this before. I thought you said he was a nice man. Your grandfather abused me, dear. I grew up in a time when divorce was highly frowned upon. Granted, I could have divorced your grandpa, but I'm ever doubtful I would have walked away from that marriage. He had reduced me to having the self-esteem of a gnat. He did sometimes lock me up in a closet, you know, for hours at a time. What? Are you kidding me? Why would he do that? I don't know, dear. I wish I did. But your Gramps had big issues. I should imagine they caused him a great deal of internal turmoil. I think it all stemmed from growing up in a family where his father abused him. It seemed that the abused eventually became the abuser. It often happens that way, I'm afraid. It's like a perpetual cycle that cannot be broken. What else did he do to you? Did he physically hurt you? Oh, believe me, sweetheart, you don't know what the man did to me, she said, waving a finger. He could lash out at me so violently I'd end up with bruises all over my body. Sometimes he even put his hands around my neck and started squeezing, but he always stopped before it got out of hand. I think he did that to scare the living daylights out of me. Obviously it worked. But he could have killed you. Why didn't you report this to anyone, like the police, for example? Shame, dear. I felt immense shame. I didn't want anyone else to know about my secret life. I was so scared people would find out the truth about your Gramps. He did have a good side to his character, you know. If that weren't the case, I would never have married him. Are you kidding, Grammy? How on earth can you have even considered him remotely good when he abused you like this? What he did to you was absolutely despicable. They should have locked him up and thrown away the key for good. And to think all this time I thought that my Gramps was a good man. Well, despite everything, dear, even an abuser can have a good heart. There were times your Gramps treated me like a princess. He could be terribly kind, gentle if he wanted to be. But he was a Jekyll and Hyde personality. One minute he was kind, the next minute he was a monster. Don't you see that? But you kept forgiving him. How could you do that? Well, in truth, sweetheart, I'd never have survived the marriage without the horses. I found that going riding whilst managing the affairs of the farm meant that I could pretend that that part of my life didn't actually exist. Of course, when I turned in for the day after a hard day's work on the farm, I would prepare the evening meal. Your pugnacious grandfather would settle down with a couple of beers after dinner, and after a while he became confrontationally antagonistic towards me, for no reason at all. He'd call me all kinds of nasty names. The silliest things would just make him blow up. I mean ridiculous things, and I suppose I became his punching bag. Tell me what happened on the night when Bertha killed him. Well, I'm going to give you a full picture of it, dear, so that you can see it in your mind's eye, as if you were really there. It began as a beautiful day, so magnificent, in fact, that I was enjoying the spectacular scenic vistas of early spring. Flora, I've never even known the service berries to be so beautiful. They were full of glorious white blossoms, along with the dogwoods, while the eastern budwoods luxuriously swathed the trees in bright clusters of delicate pink blossoms, along with the contrasting vibrant red pinks of the crab apples that complemented the viridescent greens of the landscape, making everything look absolutely breathtaking. You see, Flora dear, it had been such a bleak, oppressive, suffocating, sultry and torrid winter, so the first signs of spring was a joyful relief to many, most especially myself. Even the horses weren't immune to the changes in their natural environment. They were drooling happily in the pastures, and believe me, Flora, Horses do drool. On this particular day I wanted to enjoy it all, so I went riding on my horse. At the time she was called Sorrento Secret. That was the horse I owned in those days. And lo and behold, I was enjoying myself so much with her. It was euphorically blissful trotting down those horse-riding trails under the vast canopy of a cobalt blue sky, with the sweet fragrant scents of wild flowers wafting in the air, while the soft shafts of sunlight filtered on my shoulders and, of course, across Sorrento Secret's bay back. Oh, I could have stayed out there all day, but my mind was being badgered continuously by the formidable shopping list flashing before me in my mind like a blazing huge white sail on a boat. Your grandfather had given me a tedious, exacting list of things he wanted me to collect in town for him, which included the beef cuts he wanted me to buy for dinner. Your Gramps was particularly partial to a spot of tender, juicy prime rib. Well, when I got into the town, I decided to visit the hair salon, as I realised it had been a while since I'd had my hair done. While I was at the salon, there was a young make-up apprentice there, a delightful young girl called Petunia, who insisted on giving me a free makeover and a manicure. She wanted to collect a profile of before and after photographs for clients wishing to hire her services for upcoming events, like weddings and parties alike. After her attentive pampering, I felt amazingly good, and when I looked at my reflection in the mirror, I barely recognised myself, as instead of seeing a windswept horse rider, I was seeing a very attractive woman staring back at me. The transformation was miraculous. I couldn't believe it was me. So I decided to buy myself a pretty summer dress to complement the entire makeover. I thought even your grandfather would appreciate my new summer look. I was beginning to feel as pretty as a picture, or rather like those flowering dogwoods out there. Everyone in town was complimenting me on my look and saying that I looked absolutely amazing, that I should be on the cover of a magazine. I was about to visit the butcher when whom should I bump into but one of my dearest friends, Nancy Butterfield. We were naturally thrilled to reconnect again after so long. She insisted I joined her for coffee so that we could have a jolly good chinwag and catch up on old news. She invited me back to her house to show me some of her artwork. You see, she was an amateur artist, homing in on her craft, hoping to become an aspiring artist one day, and was already selling some of her work at garden fêtes and fairs. Some of her pictures literally took my breath away, especially a picture of 2 black and bay horses grazing in a field surrounded by bright pink crabapple trees that captivated the very essence of spring. I insisted I had to buy that picture from her. She wrapped it up in some tissue paper for me. It had been such a wonderful spring day, remiserating about everything and nothing. Before I knew it, the day had receded. I knew I'd better get back to the farmhouse to prepare dinner for your Gramps, as if dinner wasn't on the table when he returned back from the stables, he would be as bad-tempered as a grizzly. I always got edgy about getting home, as I knew I had to walk on eggshells with him. It wouldn't take much to set him off in one of his nasty rages. I realised in horror that I'd forgotten to do the shopping. I knew he wouldn't be terribly pleased with me, so the moment I got home, I industriously and energetically bustled around the pantry looking for something to prepare for him. I decided on making some spaghetti carbonara with parmesan and bacon. I knew your Gramps was banking on a steak dinner, but I decided I would tell him that the butcher was out of his favourite cuts that day, that I would pick them up for him in the morning. That way I could possibly suppress his bad temper from flaring up. Besides, he was rather partial to spaghetti carbonara. All of a sudden there was a knock at the cottage door. Who should be standing there in the doorway with my picture, along with a huge beam on his face, but Mr. Butterfield himself. He was a terribly nice man, very easy on the eye, with those quintessential all-American cowboy looks that can make many women go weak at the knees. Of course, I realised that I'd forgotten to take the picture from Mrs. Butterfield that I'd purchased from her only moments before. Little did I realise what a costly mistake that would eventually turn out to be. "Something you forgot," he said to me. "The wife asked me to drop it around to you." He handed me the picture. "How very kind of you. Please do come in," I said. I offered the man a glass of white wine, after which he said, "I must get home. Thanks for the drink." As he was leaving, who should return home from mucking out some of the stables but your Gramps himself? Mr. Butterfield walked past him, giving him a friendly nod, climbing into his truck, driving away. Your Gramps watched Mr. Butterfield leave, in a steeped, stewing silence, as if like a bag of dried prunes, he was soaking in what he'd just observed. I noticed his jaw stiffened, his body became rigidly stiff, his back straightened like a pencil. the warning signs that were like red flags to me, for I knew exactly what they meant. A storm was brewing, one I didn't want to get caught up in. Your Gramps turned around to look directly at me. His brown, predatory vulture eyes missed nothing as they hovered over my brand new dress, my fancy hairstyle and my makeup. I can only imagine what was going on in his mind. I watched in horror as his olive-skinned face developed a purple hue. "Who was that?" he asked after Mr. Butterfield had left. His voice began to boom. It sounded like it was bubbling over with anger. "That was Mr. Butterfield, Nancy Butterfield's husband. Remember Nancy, that old friend of mine? We go back a long way." Before I could finish the sentence, my husband grabbed me violently by my arms. "Look at you, woman! You're a floozy! Don't you think I don't know what this is all about? You're having an affair with that man! You bloody bitch! I knew you could never be trusted!" "I'm not having an affair. You misunderstand. I promise you, I'm not having an affair." "Misunderstand? Misunderstand, woman? Look at you, dressed to the nines with a fancy hairstyle. Enough makeup on you to star in Broadway. Goodness gracious, woman, what do you take me for? A complete imbecile? I know what this is all about. The question is, how long has this been going on? How long has this rampant seedy affair of yours been going on?" "I'm not having an affair. You've got this all completely wrong." "What's this?" said my husband, tearing open the frame that covered Mrs. Butterfield's painting that was so elegantly wrapped in pink tissue paper. "Isn't this very cosy? The bloody man brought you a gift. Been giving you a good time, has he? Even I know full well that men don't buy gifts for women just out of the goodness of their hearts. I wasn't born yesterday, nor do I have cauliflower growing between my ears." "Let me explain, Brian. You've got this all terribly wrong. If I was having an affair behind your back, I would hardly rub it in your face, would I? Do you not think I'd be a little bit more discreet about it if I was cheating on you? If you must know, I brought that picture today from Mrs. Butterfield. She's an aspiring artist. It's not a present, it's a purchase." "How convenient for you. You've worked out your clever little excuses masterfully, haven't you? You're quite an actress, aren't you? But you're not fooling me, not for a moment. Save your breath. I can see the empty wine glasses, the large pot of spaghetti on the range. Furthermore, I can see you didn't even do the grocery shopping I asked you to do. Oh no, you had much more entertaining things on your mind, didn't you? Buying me meat was the last thing on your mind, was it not?" "I'm sorry, I didn't get it. I got a bit carried away with the time, I admit, but I'll make amends tomorrow. I'll go shopping in the morning. I'll buy you your favourite cuts of meat, of prime rib at the butcher." Carried away. Carried away. Very good description. I couldn't put it better myself. You got carried away with Mr. Butterfield, you floozy." At that, I suddenly felt my cheek being struck with a violent, icy-cool thrash. It was your grandfather's hand. Then he grabbed me by the shoulders and started to shake me violently. "Stop, Brian! Please, stop! Stop! This is ridiculous! You're barking up the wrong tree! You've misunderstood everything!" The next thing I knew was that Brian's hands were around my neck. As I told you, Gramps had done this mock strangulation exercise on me before, so this wasn't something new. But this time there was something different about him. He was smouldering at the gills, almost as if smoke was coming out of his mouth. His eyes, Flora, I've never seen his eyes like that before. They were like fireballs of indignation. He was absolutely furious. I immediately thrust my legs up into his groin, kicking him very hard. He let out a huge scream, buckling over in pain. I hightailed it out of the front door, making a swift dash towards my truck. But then I realised my keys were in my purse, which was back in the house. It wasn't wise to go back. So I began to run towards the woods. Pretty soon your grandfather was following close behind me, having miraculously recovered from being hit in the groin. I wasn't wearing the most practical shoes. Worse still, I couldn't run in my soft, bare feet. So he was gaining ground on me very fast. We were in the woods by now, and I was breathing rapidly. I held up my hands in a pedestrian stop signal. "Stop, Brian! You must listen to me. I'm not having an affair. I wouldn't cheat on you. I promise I would never do that to you." Before I knew it, Brian had pounced on me. He wouldn't listen to reason, as clearly images of me and Mr. Butterfield frolicking around in a field somewhere, like two passionate lovers, was whirling around in his head, teasing, tormenting and ridiculing him. "Wouldn't you?" he screamed. "Stop lying to me. I know you're having an affair with Mr. Butterfield, woman. I know you're having an affair. How could you do this to me?" By this time he had thrust me back on the ground and was sitting on top of my chest, leaning over me with his strong hands grasped over my neck. I was oscillating my arms and legs frantically, trying desperately to create enough wiggle room to escape. But I was pinned down by Brian's weight, which was crushing my upper torso, squeezing out the oxygen from my lungs. I could see that Brian was incensed with me. There was no coming back from this. It was like everything had transpired against me to make Brian believe I was having an affair. You see that such a blow to his ego was a huge kick in his guts, and as far as he was concerned, I wasn't going to get away with this under any circumstances. It was beyond the point of any rational reasoning. I knew in those moments I was about to die. It was like being in an accident. Everything around you morphs into slow motion. All of a sudden we heard a huge growl, much like a piercing, jagged rumble. For a second Brian looked up through the tree line, his eyes growing anxious. The moonlight was casting its shadows through the trees, so visibility wasn't too bad. He loosened his grip around my neck, while I was struggling to break free. All of a sudden it sounded like a trumpeting male elephant in musk was charging towards us at an alarming speed. And that was when we saw her, a large, furious humanoid, covered in hair, staring at the both of us with eyes so wide, as if reading the situation like a book. It was Bertha. Brian let out a huge, discomposing scream as Bertha lunged willfully towards him, kicking him with one huge blow of her feet, as though she was kicking a soccer ball. She continued to kick him over and over and over again. I could hear him screaming. Then he groaned, and then finally I heard nothing at all. It was silent. I arched over to your Gramps, and as I was leaning over him, I realised he was dead. I can honestly say, Flora, that all I felt was this overwhelming sense of relief. I just knew in that moment that I was free from a man whom had tortured my life for over 10 long years with his relentless verbal and physical abuse. I hate to say this, Flora, I was glad he was dead. I wasn't afraid of Bertha. She rescued me from your Gramps. I knew without her intervention I would be the one lying there dead. She knew your Gramps had tried to kill me. She had come to my rescue. Bertha pointed at my belly. She pressed her head against it as if listening to my womb. It was then I realised that I might be pregnant, for Bertha seemed to have extrasensory abilities, as if she could read intentions and energy. Of course I was to find out I was indeed pregnant with your mother. How Bertha could perceive this little life growing inside of me, I could not fathom, but she clearly did. Of course I called the sheriff. I told him the whole story. Of course, I didn't tell him exactly everything, but I did tell him how Brian had tried to strangle me based on a misunderstanding. He could see the telltale red marks around my neck. I told him I had no idea what had killed your Gramps. I wasn't going to tell him about Bertha, that was for sure. She had saved my life. Why would I get her into trouble on my account? That wasn't going to happen on my watch. I was surprised when the sheriff actually said to me, "I don't feel very sorry for your husband. He tried to kill you. Any man that lays a hand on a woman is not worthy of any respect." I'm not sure what the coroner ruled the manner of death to be, but she perceived that Brian had died from serious internal bleeding due to serious crushing injuries done by something substantially large like an elephant. I wasn't saying anything. I kept my lips firmly shut. I remember at the funeral people were coming up to me, taking me into their arms and saying things like, "You're so much better off without him, dear." I was to find out later that my husband had been having a string of affairs during the course of our early marriage. Everyone in town knew about it except me. I mean, how humiliating is that? But there you go. That's the way the cookie crumbles. No wonder he thought you were cheating, 'cause he was cheating himself. He was seeing the world through his own duplicitous eyes, I said to my grandmother. Well, after your Gramps died, my brother moved on to the farm to help me manage it. I was like a butterfly emerging from a cocoon. I was so incredibly happy. I felt I could live and breathe again. Soon afterwards your mother was born. Bertha would come and look at your mother adoringly. She would hold your mother so gently, rocking her to sleep in her overlong arms. Your mother cried a lot in those days, but the moment she was in Bertha's arms, the screaming stopped. She would start to gurgle and chuckle happily. She was a natural mother, Bertha was. I knew that any baby of mine was safe in her charge. She would play with your mother all the time, watching over her diligently, which was a massive help for me, as I had lots of work to do on the farm. Before long she became an intrinsically important part of our household, and often ate dinner with us. What about her family? Surely she had some. Bertha was on her own. I think her partner had been shot dead by a hunter. That's what she communicated to me. She didn't want another partner after him. She was very loyal. I think both of us, without males in our lives, were treading on common ground, so to speak. But I mean, didn't you think it was strange that she was covered in hair? No, not really. If you have a friend covered in acne, other people might notice their skin condition. But if you live with them all the time, you barely notice it at all. In our minds, Bertha was like that. Yes, she had hair growing all over her body. Yes, she was idiosyncratic and unusual. Yes, she was big. But she was our friend, our special friend. Sadly, it was a mere 2 months after that conversation with my grandmother she died peacefully in her sleep at the nursing home. I'm just forever grateful that I have a greater understanding of the creature that babysat me all those years ago. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.